In the late 1970s, the world witnessed one of the darkest chapters in modern history, a mass tragedy that would forever redefine the meaning of blind devotion. At the center stood Jim Jones, a charismatic preacher who promised equality, peace, and salvation. But behind his magnetic voice and utopian dreams lay a man consumed by paranoia, control, and delusion. On November 18, 1978, in the dense jungles of Guyana, more than 900 followers of his people's temple died in a mass murder-suicide, an event that still chills the human conscience. Among the dead were children, including some of Jones's own 8 offspring. Who was Jim Jones, the man who once preached compassion, but orchestrated one of history's greatest horrors? And what became of the children who bore his name, born into a legacy drenched in blood and belief? This is the story of Jim Jones and his 8 children. A story of idealism, indoctrination, survival, and the unshakable shadow of Jonestown. James Warren Jim Jones was born on May 13, 1931, in the small town of Crete, Indiana. His early life was shaped by poverty, isolation, and a deep hunger for belonging. His father, James Thurman Jones, was a disabled World War I veteran, and his mother, Lynetta Putnam Jones, was a strong-willed woman who believed her son was destined for greatness. From childhood, Jim was described as intelligent, strange, and obsessed with religion. He conducted mock funerals for neighborhood animals and delivered fiery sermons to imaginary congregations in the family's barn. By the time he reached adulthood, Jones had transformed that childhood fascination into a fervent mission. He became a preacher who mixed Christian teachings with socialist ideals, speaking passionately about racial equality and economic justice. In 1956, he founded the People's Temple in Indianapolis, a church that attracted African Americans, the poor, and those disillusioned with mainstream religion. His message was powerful, a promise of equality, in an America still scarred by segregation. Jones married Marceline Baldwin in 1949, a nurse who shared his idealism and compassion for the downtrodden. Together they would form not just a family, but the nucleus of a movement that blurred the line between faith and fanaticism. Over the years, the couple adopted several children of different ethnic backgrounds, a deliberate act Jones called his rainbow family. This family, he said, would represent the world he dreamed of, one free of racism and inequality. But within that dream lay control. As his following grew, so did his need for dominance over his congregation, his wife, and his children. The seeds of Jonestown's tragedy were already being sown in the man who even then demanded absolute loyalty under the banner of love. By the early 1970s, Jim Jones's People's Temple had evolved from a progressive church into a powerful, insular movement with thousands of followers. At first, his message resonated: integration, equality, communal living. But beneath the surface, paranoia began to erode everything he had built. Jones no longer saw himself as a mere preacher. He believed he was a prophet, even a godlike savior. His sermons grew darker, filled with warnings of an impending apocalypse and betrayal by the American government. When journalists and former members began exposing allegations of abuse, forced labor, and financial manipulation, Jones's world started to crumble. In 1977, he fled with nearly 1,000 followers to a remote settlement in Guyana, a place he named Jonestown, his so-called socialist paradise. But instead of the utopia he promised, Jonestown became a prison hidden in the jungle. Armed guards patrolled its perimeter. Members were forced to work long hours under grueling heat, surrounded by propaganda blaring through loudspeakers proclaiming Jones's divine mission. The charismatic preacher had turned into a paranoid ruler. He staged mock suicide drills, forcing his followers to drink what they thought was poison as a test of loyalty. His health deteriorated. He relied heavily on drugs and recorded endless late-night rants filled with delusion and despair. Meanwhile, reports of abuse reached U.S. authorities, prompting Congressman Leo Ryan to visit Jonestown in November 1978 to investigate. What happened next would seal Jim Jones's name in infamy. as Ryan and several defectors prepared to leave, gunmen from the People's Temple ambushed them at an airstrip, killing the congressman and others. Hours later, Jones gathered his followers for what he called revolutionary suicide. On the chilling recording that would later be known as the death tape, Jones's voice urged his followers to die with dignity. One by one, men, women, and children, including many of his own, drank the cyanide-laced punch. When the bodies were discovered, more than 900 people lay dead. Among them were at least 6 of Jones's 8 children. The man who once promised paradise had led his people and his family into a nightmare of his own making. The aftermath of Jonestown was chaos, disbelief, and horror. When Guyanese soldiers arrived at the compound on November 19, 1978, the scene defied comprehension. Hundreds of bodies dressed in bright clothes lay face down in the mud arms, entwined, many clutching their children. The air was heavy with the smell of death and the echo of Jones's final sermon still playing from a recorder nearby. At the center of it all, Jim Jones lay dead from a gunshot wound to the head, most likely self-inflicted. News of the massacre spread across the world like wildfire. In the United States, it was nearly impossible to grasp how a man who once preached love and racial harmony had orchestrated such horror. Reporters, psychologists, and religious scholars flooded television screens asking the same question. How could so many people willingly follow a man to their deaths? For those who survived, members who had been away from Jonestown that day, the shock was unbearable. Some refused to believe Jones had truly done it, clinging to denial as a means to survive the guilt. Others confessed that, even until the end, they would have drunk the poison if he had asked. Among the few survivors were 2 of Jim Jones's sons, Stephen and Jim Jr., who had been away from the compound playing in a basketball tournament in Georgetown. They learned of the massacre only after returning to find their family and community gone. In one day, they had lost not only their parents and siblings, but nearly everyone they had ever known. The bodies of the dead were flown back to the United States in military transport planes. Thousands of relatives came forward desperate to identify loved ones. Yet many victims remained unnamed, buried together in mass graves at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California, a haunting monument to faith gone mad. The government investigations that followed painted a chilling portrait of absolute control. Jones's voice was law, his followers' devotion absolute, and their deaths the final act of his delusion. For the surviving children, that legacy would define the rest of their lives. In the years following the massacre, the surviving children of Jim Jones faced the near impossible task of rebuilding their lives while carrying the heaviest surname in American history. Stephen Gandhi Jones and Jim Jones Jr., the only 2 biological sons who lived through the tragedy, returned to the United States with nothing, no family, no community, and no clear sense of who they were without their father's shadow. The world viewed them through the same lens as the man who caused the deaths of hundreds. Some saw them as victims, others as cursed remnants of a madman, yet both sons refused to let their lives be defined by Jonestown. They moved quietly, avoiding the spotlight, determined to create normalcy out of chaos. Stephen, the biological son of Jim and Marceline, settled into a private life and eventually spoke publicly only on rare occasions, reflecting with clarity and grief on what had happened. Jim Jones Jr., the first African-American child adopted by a white couple in Indiana, pursued a career in education and social work, dedicating himself to helping others, perhaps a silent act of atonement for a legacy he never chose. For both men, surviving Jonestown was not liberation. It was a lifelong sentence of reckoning. In interviews decades later, Stephen described the constant battle with guilt, not for something he did, but for having lived when his siblings and friends had not. Jim Jr. often spoke about the moment he learned of the massacre. The disbelief, the hollow numbness, the silence that followed when words could no longer make sense of the loss. Meanwhile, the other 6 Jones children who perished, Lou, Suzanne, Stephanie, Tim, and the adopted Korean-born sisters, Kimo and Agnes, became names carved into memorial stones, their lives forever frozen in the tragedy their father created. Rebuilding identity for the survivors meant confronting an unbearable paradox to honor their loved ones without honoring the man who destroyed them. Over time, both Stephen and Jim Jr. found purpose not in escaping the past, but in understanding it. They participated in documentaries, educational programs, and discussions about cult psychology and manipulation, using their voices to prevent history from repeating itself. Jonestown had taken their family, but it had also given them a haunting kind of clarity that evil often disguises itself in compassion, and blind faith can be as lethal as any poison. For the surviving sons of Jim Jones, the true reckoning came not in the days or months after Jonestown, but in the years that followed when the silence finally grew too loud to bear. Stephen Jones, in his early 20s at the time, spent years refusing to speak publicly about his father. The guilt of survival haunted him. He had argued with his father in the final months, sensing the unraveling madness. Yet he could not stop what was coming. That helplessness became a wound he carried long after the bodies were buried. When Stephen finally spoke out, his words revealed a mixture of anguish, love, and betrayal that only a child of Jim Jones could understand. He admitted that despite everything, he still loved his father. The man who had once held him, taught him about equality, and inspired him to believe in humanity. But he also hated what that man had become. "I hate what he did," Stephen once said. "I hate that he made me love him." It was a confession as raw as it was human, a son torn between memory and truth. For Jim Jones Jr., the emotional turning point arrived through confrontation, not avoidance. As an adopted black child in a white family that preached racial unity, he had once been the symbol of his father's rainbow family. After Jonestown, he became the living proof of how far that dream had fallen. Speaking years later, he described a moment of reckoning while visiting the mass grave in Oakland. Standing among hundreds of names, including those of his siblings, he realized that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing not to let hatred define him. Both men, in their separate ways, came to the same revelation: the only way to survive Jonestown was to understand it. They began to see that the tragedy was not just about one man's madness, but about human vulnerability, the yearning for belonging, the seduction of certainty, and the cost of surrendering one's will to another. Through grief and introspection, the sons of Jim Jones transformed from silent victims into living witnesses. Their pain became purpose, their shame a lesson. In embracing the complexity of their father, both the visionary and the tyrant, they reclaimed the humanity that Jonestown tried to erase. In the decades that followed Jonestown, Stephen and Jim Jones Jr. slowly built lives defined not by their father's shadow, but by their own choices. Their journeys were not those of redemption, for they had nothing to atone for. Instead, they were journeys toward understanding, toward piecing together identity from the wreckage of a nightmare. Stephen Jones chose to live quietly for many years, avoiding publicity and rarely granting interviews. He struggled with depression and survivor's guilt, haunted by dreams of that final day in Guyana. Over time, he began to speak with survivors, not as the son of Jim Jones, but as someone who shared their loss. His openness offered a kind of healing both for himself and for those still searching for closure. He later worked in the field of rehabilitation and social support, channeling pain into empathy, trying in his own way to rebuild what his father destroyed. Jim Jones Jr. took a different path. Grounded and analytical, he pursued education and dedicated his life to helping others. As a counselor and administrator, he used his experience to guide those trapped in destructive belief systems or cycles of abuse. He spoke publicly about the dangers of blind faith and the importance of questioning authority, lessons etched into his life by tragedy. In interviews, his words were calm but resolute. The story of Jonestown isn't about religion. It's about control. It's about giving up your power to someone else. Both men found families of their own. Becoming fathers allowed them to redefine the meaning of that word, not as authority or dominance, but as care, humility, and protection. Each child they raised became a quiet victory against the destiny others expected them to inherit. Their continued existence decades after the jungle fell silent became a statement of resistance against despair, against the idea that one man's madness could dictate the course of every life he touched. Through education, honesty, and self-reflection, Stephen and Jim Jr. proved that even in the aftermath of one of history's darkest moments, there could still be light, fragile but real. They no longer ran from the name Jones. They redefined it. From tragedy, they carved meaning. From loss, they built purpose. In doing so, they gave voice not only to the children of Jim Jones, but to every survivor who ever escaped the orbit of a false savior. More than 4 decades have passed since the tragedy in Jonestown, yet the echoes of that jungle clearing still haunt history. The name Jim Jones remains synonymous with deception, fanaticism, and blind obedience, but it also carries another quieter legacy, the story of those who lived on. For Stephen and Jim Jones Jr., survival was never about escape. It was about endurance, about learning how to breathe again in a world that could never understand the weight they carried. They did not choose their father, nor the destiny tied to his name, but they chose what to do with it. In interviews and public talks, both men have expressed a simple truth, that Jonestown must not be remembered as a story of madness alone, but as a warning of how power, when left unchecked, can consume even the best of intentions. Today, the surviving sons live quiet, productive lives. They are fathers, mentors, and advocates, their existence a living contradiction to the death their father brought. Through them, the Jones family name no longer ends in the jungle. It continues transformed, redefined, and freed from the grip of one man's delusion. At the mass grave in Oakland, where hundreds of victims rest together under the gray California sky, a simple plaque bears the words, "In memory of the victims of Jonestown." Among those names are 6 of Jim Jones's children lives lost before they could choose their path. But the 2 who survived have ensured that the story does not belong to their father alone. The tragedy of Jonestown is no longer just a chronicle of death. It is a cautionary tale about belief manipulation and the fragile line between devotion and destruction. And through the lives of Jim Jones's surviving children, it is also a story of quiet defiance, proof that, even from the darkest faith, humanity can reclaim its light.